evening. On behalf of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, my name is Howard Weisband. I'm a fellow at the Jerusalem Center and striving to, on behalf of the Center, to create the Daniel Elazar Institute for Jewish Communal Studies. The importance of our topic this evening is perhaps really in front of our very eyes by the fact that there are many changes already afoot in the Jewish world, based upon the economic downturn that has occurred, and also the Madoff scandal that unfortunately occurred as well. The question, though, before us, perhaps, that our panelists will deal with, are these immediate responses to financial pressures, or are they, hopefully, decisions that have been thought through for the long-term impact based upon new realities? We'll leave the question at that. This, we hope, we believe, will be the first of many activities through the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs of the newly established annual J. Elazar Institute. And I'd like to recognize just a few people to begin our evening. First, Harriet Elazar. Danny Elazar's brother, David Elazar, and sister-in-law, Ruth Elazar. And also dear friends of mine from Memphis, Tennessee, and Jerusalem, Alvin and Elaine Gordon. Alvin is a representative of the Bornblum Foundation, who has had the vision to help us with some seed money establish this institute. So we thank you as well. I want to express appreciation to Chaya Herskovic and the staff at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs for their help in putting together this evening. And special appreciation to two gentlemen who have helped me immensely, to Michael Mashbaum and to Stuart Schnee. So thank you very much. It gives me also pleasure to call upon Ambassador Dori Gold, the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, to bring greetings, brachot, a few brief remarks. Dori, who has been very supportive, has flown in just a few hours ago internationally. So not only is he pretty tired, but he tells me there's another meeting this evening. So he's going to bring us brachot and then stay as long as hopefully he can.
Well, as many of you know, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs in the last number of years has been more focusing on areas like foreign and defense policy of Israel and the sort of formal international contacts of Israel in the Middle East, rather than the, let's say, classic work on Jewish community studies. We have maintained a very important program under the chairman of our board, Manfred Gerstenfeld, who has been running a program on changing Jewish communities, which has allowed many Jewish leaders to come to the center to speak. But we haven't had the kind of, let's say, interaction that I think Howard is conceiving of with the Council on Israel-Diaspora Relations. Jerusalem Center is whatever the fellows of the center want it to be. And I, of course, have my own specialization and background, but it is extremely important that this other purpose of the Jerusalem Center continue. Now, it's hard to look to the late Professor Daniel Elazar to know which direction we should go in, because he was essentially a Renaissance man. And he could run a seminar on how to reorganize the Jewish agency in a manner that reflects our sort of biblical heritage. And then a week later, he could run a seminar on confederation between Palestinians and Jordan. And so we have all of this legacy, which all of us carry and all of us want to continue. So I just want to, first of all, say thank you to Howard for taking the initiative as a fellow of the Jerusalem Center and building this project. The need for Israel understanding the diaspora and vice versa is somewhat of a rhetorical statement you hear from time to time by Israeli politicians who are looking for something to say. but it's a real need. And Howard has this in his blood. He knows what's involved. He knows how to structure it, and he was a student of Daniel Elazar. So I'm looking forward to the program he's putting together. I'm looking forward to hearing what I can hear of the lectures tonight. And it's fitting that Daniel Elazar's name be on this effort. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you very, very much. Professor Daniel Elazar, who was Daniel Elazar? Dory already made mention. Many of you had the good fortune, as I did, to know Danny and to be close to him. But looking at his academic accomplishments, I want to take a few moments and indicate, just briefly, the areas in which Danny was involved, and you'll see the breadth vis-a-vis at least the Jewish world in that respect, and perhaps what we hope to accomplish in establishing this institute. Dan Elazar was renowned worldwide as a political scientist in the area of federalism. He took those principles of federalism and he adapted them to Jewish life in fathering, if you will, a subfield of political science, of Jewish political studies, the Jewish political tradition. His contribution to Jewish communal studies and to Jewish life is extensive and everlasting. He pioneered scholarship in that Jewish political tradition, in Covenant, Brit, the Jewish polity, world Jewry, Sephardic Jewry, himself, David, Sephardim, Israel Diaspora relations, which was a primary area of involvement for Danny, Jewish peoplehood, power and morality, governance and decision-making, the Israeli political system, and community assessments all over the Jewish globe. It was the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which he founded in 1976, where his work and leadership often led to practical organizational change in Jewish life. He was professor both at Temple University and Bar Ilan University. And the question is, why a new institute? Why do we need it? It is our hope and belief that the Daniel J. Elazar Institute for Jewish Communal Studies will promote research, study, and teaching of contemporary Jewish communal issues, Israel diaspora relations, and emerging trends in Jewish communities, particularly in the context of Professor Elazar's thought and extensive writings, but not necessarily limited to. In doing so, the Institute will seek to create unique opportunities for the leadership of Jewish life worldwide and the academic community to collaborate in order to strengthen the future of the Jewish people. Important phraseology there, that we look to bring together, what's the Kiddush, if you will, to bring together on a consistent basis, not as scholar in residence, not as panel member, not as, a one-off, as some would say. Jewish leadership, professional and lay leadership on a consistent basis with the academic leadership to learn with and from one another. And in short, I must tell you, my observation, and I think that of others, these are areas of leadership education that are lacking since Dan's passing when he was directly involved, almost 10 years ago since he passed away. And I would posit, and many would posit, are in critical need today, these arenas of Dan's involvement in Jewish communal life and with Jewish leadership. Part of the Institute will be this Council on Israel Diaspora Relations. The idea is to bring leadership together from Israel, from diaspora, an example that we have this evening, around a critical contemporary issue, address the issue, and foster exchange about that issue toward the betterment of policy. Dan Elazar wrote, on the occasion of Israel's 50th anniversary, he wrote as follows on Israel diaspora relations. Globalization exposes all Jews to greater opportunities to leave the Jewish path more than ever before, or even more than they may seek. To date, responses to this great question, whether Jews can remain part and parcel of Jewish life and how, to date, those responses have been local and, more than that, segmented amongst the various branches of Judaism. They also have been inadequate, Elazar wrote. Issues have surfaced as national and collective ones, requiring agreement among the entire Jewish people. Now that they have become world issues, there is no turning back, which means that Jewry must have the appropriate instrumentalities to deal with those issues and to moderate the ways in which they are confronted. That was a paragraph from a paper entitled A Partnership for Israel-Diaspora Relations, which Dan Elazar wrote in June of 1998. A copy of the paper is available for you as you leave, for your taking, and for your reading. Read it carefully. I ask you, do not look at the organizational structures which Dan was writing about, because they've changed. They've changed. But look at the principles and the directions that he articulated and learn from that. More than a decade ago, Dan Elazar was talking about globalization. Not a year ago, not 2 years ago, more than a decade ago, when you read his material. Dan told us, we learned that we must pause, we must reflect, we must learn, and then take action. Not a process that takes place often enough in today's Jewish world. Also, I would say to you, look in the near future for a new interactive website that we'll be launching within the framework of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs for the Dan Elazar Institute. You'll be invited to participate in that platform, just as you're participating this evening, with your thoughts and comments, and contributing to that dialogue that will take place within that framework. We turn to the issue for tonight. The issue tonight has become rapidly a major ethical and practical consideration for Jewish leadership, locally, nationally, and globally. To confront the Jewish world in a new economic climate, post-Madoff and beyond, what we've learned and where we go from here, we are fortunate to have two professional leaders, and I'm proud to say two friends, to address us from within their own experience and expertise in this very question. I'll take a few moments to introduce both of our speakers so that then we won't be interrupted as they speak. Addressing us first will be Dr. Jeffrey Solomon, who is the president of the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Philanthropies, a group of foundations operating in Canada, Israel, and the United States. Among the foundation's innovative launches are Taglit Birthright, Israel, and Reboot, two initiatives aimed at connecting young assimilated Jews to their tradition. Also, an innovative project is the Gift of New York, a powerful response to September 11th, 2001, which helps to heal families of victims through the power of culture, and Project Involvement, another initiative, an educational reform program serving some 265,000 Israeli elementary school students. Jeff previously served as the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of UJA Federation of Greater New York. He's an author of over 80 publications. He's served as an adjunct associate professor at NYU, New York University, and sits on numerous nonprofit and foundation boards, including the Council of Foundations, where he chaired the Committee on Ethics and Practice. Right on tonight. He's received a number of honors from professional associations and universities. He has recently completed a book, The Art of Giving, Where the Soul Meets the Business Plan with Charles Bronfman, which is being published by Jose Bass in October 2009. We look forward to seeing it and reading your book. Avraham Infeld is currently director of the Avraham Infeld Educational Initiatives, providing consulting services in Jewish education and funding strategies for education in Israel. In this capacity, he also serves as senior consultant on Jewish peoplehood to the Nadav Fund. In the 1970s, Abraham founded Melitz, a nonprofit educational service institution that fosters Jewish identity, rooted in pluralistic understanding of Jewish life and the centrality of Israel. In 2003, Abraham was appointed president and international director of Hillel, the Foundation for Jewish Campus Life, and served in that capacity in Washington until September 2006. He then returned to Israel to assume the presidency of the Chase Family Foundation, which was suddenly forced to close, we all know, in December 2008 due to the Madoff fraud. A native of South Africa, Avram immigrated to Israel in 1959. He is married to Ellen, who is with us here this evening. Originally from New Jersey, and they share 4 children and 13 grandchildren. He's a graduate. 14. How many? 14. You've got to change right here. It was yesterday. But I have to tell you, we became friends 25, 36 years ago. There are people that know him longer than that. And I remember when Avram had his first grandchild, and he was 42 years old. And I said, how can you have a grandchild at age 42? Well, now he's 46, is it? So, in any case, you should also know that he's a graduate of Hebrew University in Bible and Jewish History, and at Tel Aviv University's Law School. In 2005, he was awarded the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's prestigious Samuel Rothberg Prize for Jewish Education, the first specialist in informal Jewish education to be so honored. Jeffrey, the microphone.
Like many of you, especially at moments like this, I missed Elazar. When I came to the UJA Federation in 1986, it was at the point after a 14-year process of UJA and Federation of New York merging. And one of the decisions that was made was to allocate funds directly to projects in Israel rather than have to go through the national and international system. And we asked Danny to serve as a consultant to that process to teach us how to do that ethically and smartly. And his wisdom has always been there for those of us who work with him. When I looked at tonight's subject, the Jewish world and the new economic climate, post-Madoff and beyond, what have we learned, where do we go from here? 2 stories came to mind. The first took place about 33 years ago in Miami, when I was in the Jewish Home and Hospital in Miami, and it was at the 100th birthday of a resident, Giselle Schwartz. And it was a birthday party. There was Miami Herald reporter, photographer there, and he was about 22 years old, and he really got into it, got very excited. At the end of the party, he went up to Mrs. Schwartz and said, Mrs. Schwartz, I only have one wish. I hope to be here next year for your 101st birthday party. She looked at him and said, Sonny, you look healthy enough to make it. We are all healthy enough to make it, and we have to begin with that reality. The question then becomes, what do we do? And that reminds me of the classic story of this very nasty United States senator who was finally retiring after 36 years in the Senate. And he was given prime time to give his final address. And he turned to his aide, he said, I want a smashing address. And so he got up, papers before him, and said, my fellow Americans, yes, we have problems in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've got the answers. And yes, our economy is in shambles, but it will get better because I've got the answers. And yes, we are still struggling with social issues in this country, and I've got the answers. And he turned the page and said, you're on your own, you bastard. So I don't know how many answers we have tonight, but I think we should start with a little bit of history. And history tells us that philanthropy never drops as much as the Dow. Philanthropy recovers more quickly, and philanthropy has even grown in times of recessions. If you look at the UJA giving in 1929, 30, 31, 32, 33, it was up every year. So even in the midst of the American Depression, Jewish philanthropy continued to grow. You look at that history and then take a look at the context in which we're dealing with today, starting with the affinity fraud of Mr. Madoff. 51 foundations died as a result of Madoff. 143 foundations were seriously injured. Those are losses, but they're losses in the context of the perfect storm, of the triple whammy of, number one, the foundations, many of which were supporting general philanthropic goals around the world, but most of which were supporting Jewish philanthropic goals. You also had many of the institutions of the Jewish community directly or indirectly invested in Madoff. It's no secret. Yeshiva University, Hadassah, American Jewish Congress, we can go through the list of the losses that they've suffered. And then you have major donors who are supporters of those institutions who also suffer losses. And we don't know how quickly we're going to recover. And this is in the context of the worst recession since the Great Depression. And so what does that mean? If one takes a look at the foundation field, one discovers that $200 billion has been lost. And the economists tell us that foundation giving will reach the 2007 level not before 2017. That's a long way off. And so we're not going to have an immediate fix, even if the economy recovers. And perhaps more significant in terms of what it means for Jewish nonprofits, Israeli amutot, has to do with the issues of trust. Madoff, as much as money was lost, created a huge trust deficit. People really wonder, who can they trust? How can they trust? Especially when it comes to the nonprofit economy, which makes no sense because you're giving money based solely on trust, that your participation in it can help change the world. So it has implications for transparency. It has implications for due diligence. Hopefully we have all learned the lessons that social prominence must never trump due diligence. Anybody who did any due diligence on Madoff did not invest with Madoff. And it's one thing for people to do it with their own funds. It's so much more challenging when you're stewarding those funds, whether it's in a foundation or an endowment. And due diligence must become the first step. So the choice we're going to have is, can we do more with less, or will we do less with less? We know we're going to have less for at least the immediate future. And this comes at a time when philanthropy was undergoing the most massive generational change in history. Professor Elazar would have told us the importance, and he's written about the importance of communal giving as an act of community, as a Jewish act of community. And the greatest change that's taken place in the past decade or two is the growth of private Jewish giving and the decline of public Jewish giving. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So the old philanthropist was a philanthropist who gave to community and let the community figure out how best to spend that money. The new philanthropist has been studied extensively by Professor Paul Shervish at Boston College. And what he says is, a generation ago, people gave to nonprofits because they supported the missions of those nonprofits. Today, people give to those nonprofits who support their personal mission. A Copernican twist in the motivations of giving, with great implications for how the Jewish community is organized. Because if you take a look at the extraordinary success of federated giving, you see 6 factors at work. And as we explore those 6 factors, we have an understanding of the change that's taken place. First, the Jewish community was affluent. Second, Jews were self-identified as Jews. It was at the core of who they were. Third, as such, they felt a sense of insecurity, either because of the glass ceilings at home, the anti-Semitism that they felt in their communities, or because of what was threatening Jews around the world. Fourth, there was an organic connection to Israel. It is not accidental that the best fundraising year on an inflation-adjusted basis was 1948. Fifth, the idea of the Kehillah was closer to people because they were closer to the immigrant generation. They understood the concept of community and how communities were organized. And sixth, there was no great competition because, in the States at least, the great universities, hospitals, museums weren't terribly interested in Jewish money because they weren't terribly interested in having Jews around. Of those 6 factors, only the first is still true. The Jewish community is still affluent. Jews are less self-identified. When one looks at the research on identity, Jewish identity is one of multiple identities. It is a very different world than it was. The sense of insecurity is not there. The universities that had quotas today have Jewish presidents. Communities around the world have been brought home, and the sense of insecurity, while there are plenty of reasons for that insecurity today, it's not as visceral as it once was. The connection to Israel, starting at age 50, as you go down in age, there's a greater and greater disconnect. American Jewish Committee study shows that American Jewish college students are no closer to Israel than American college students. That's a profound factor, and it's time for a commercial. The only exception to that are young people who come to Israel. Once they come to Israel, lots of things change, and one of them is their connection to Israel. Fifth, the notion of Kehillah is lost. Donors want to follow their money. If they could put a computer chip in their check to see exactly how that money was being spent, they would. They expect accountability in ways they never did. And sixth, there is great competition for Jewish money. If you take a look at Maishtetl in New York, we have 2 wonderful Protestant hospitals, Columbia Presbyterian and New York Hospital, both chaired by Jews, each of whom gave between $100 and $200 million to those hospitals. If you look at the last 5 wings at the Met, 4 of them have Jewish names. So the world has radically changed. What does that mean in terms of Jewish giving? Well, the UJA Federation system has gone from 900,000 donors, just under 900,000 donors, to just under 300,000 donors. And if you look on an inflation-adjusted basis, to replicate 1948, it would be raising $1.8 billion. It's not raising half that. To replicate 1980, it would be raising $1.4 billion. And there was nothing dramatic in 1980. And it's not raising half of that. So, huge change. There were a number of strategic decisions along the way that have not served the community well, not the least of which is to concentrate on major donors at the cost of bringing the next generation along. There's been virtually no investment in bringing smaller donors, younger donors, and the tragedy of that is every $500,000 donor tells the story of the first time they made their $25 gift. And that's the piece that has been missing and reflects some of the problems that exist. Within Israel, 88 to 92% of the philanthropic support for Amutot is imported. It is a huge risk to the third sector in Israel. And with this recession, we are going to see the dynamics of that risk. So that leads us to the question of, are we capable of changing behaviors to make our systems of caring for people more efficient and more effective? So let's imagine for a moment that it's 2012. And we're going to look at a couple of scenarios. First scenario, the recession is over, but Jewish philanthropic support will not reach its pre-recessionary level for another 5 years. Scenario 1, 1,200 Jewish organizations in Israel, Europe, and North America disappear, 80% of which were created since 1990 to better serve the communities in which they operate for social, educational, and identity services. The Jewish Agency and JDC together lose another $70 million in support from around the Jewish world. There is negative growth for the first time in the history of the third sector in Israel. Quality of life measures show deteriorating benchmark numbers in comparison to all OECD countries. Now let's look at scenario 2. A health insurance trust in the United States now covers some 40,000 employees from 2,100 Jewish organizations, saving 20% of the premium cost for a total savings of $96 million. Buildings in several large cities are offering space at below market rate because they've been taken off the tax rolls to house 400 small and mid-sized Jewish organizations, offering central and shared services. Savings estimated at $5 million. An information technology company that limits its market to 1,000 Jewish and Israeli nonprofits, offering the highest quality services at 85% of comparable costs, while providing a profit to its foundation program-related investor shareholders, which is then distributed in grants, for a total savings of about $12 million. A common application and reporting form from all foundations, federations, and non-governmental funders serving the Jewish world. The overhead savings to Jewish nonprofits would be $3,000 to $5,000 per report per application. A report card comparing effectiveness, returns on investments in 8 adolescent Jewish education programs designed for donors and cooperating agency boards and management. Priceless. If we could change our behaviors to think in those terms, to think systemically, and not as if each one of us is discovering the wheel together, think about what the possibilities might be at this moment in time. As our President of the United States has said, a recession is a terrible thing to waste. If Dan Elazar left a legacy, it is that analysis and the creation of intellectual capital is not simply a game for academics, but one that brings added value to the world of practice. For the North Americans, developing an alternative to the Kehillah emerged from the desires of donors for a more scientific, less duplicative approach. We've lost that lesson. 100 years later, it's time for us to learn it again and to make sure that the golden age of philanthropy, especially Jewish philanthropy, is not over. The generational twist is going to be upon us. The late Gary Tobin, may his memory be a blessing, and I did research on American donations of more than $10 million between 1995 and 2000. Our findings were fascinating because we discovered with 2% of the population, Jews represented 18% of the donors and 22% of the money in those $10 million and over gifts. But 94% of those gifts went to secular causes. Only 6% stayed in the Jewish community. Imagine a Jewish community that has the compelling stories that re-attracts those kinds of donors. That's our challenge. That's what we need to do. And it's up to us, collectively, to try to change the future or shrink from the past. Thank you.
I too am very honored to be part of an evening dedicated to the memory of Daniel Elazar, whom I had great love, much respect, and I thank you, Howard, for your efforts in making this happen. Franz Kafka once said that science is the ability to say in words that everyone can understand things they never knew before. Poetry is the exact opposite. To say in confusing terms, things that everybody knows. You were the scientist today, Jeff. I may have to be the poet. You didn't need much facts, but I'd like to begin with a story as Jeff did. On December the 11th, 1930, the largest Jewish bank that existed then in New York, the Bank of the United States, closed as a result of the recession that was started on October 29, on December the 11th. 78 years later, on December the 11th, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I came to a meeting at the JDC in New York of the Task Force on Arab-Israeli Issues, and the meeting was about to be chaired by one Jeff Solomon. Surprisingly, something I've never done before, I came early to the meeting. And I found Jeff in deep discussion with other people in the room, and he was talking about the terrible plight that foundations had found themselves in as a result of the recession. They were cutting back, they were struggling to establish new priorities. I didn't understand the conversation. That very morning, we at the Chase Foundation had held our board meeting. The chairman of our board, Mr. Stanley Chase, informed us that morning that his own personal health was not in good shape, but the health of the foundation was in magnificent shape. He increased the size of the foundation by adding several tens of millions to the foundation. We approved 3 major new investments in the city of Jerusalem to the extent of almost $10 million. The most exciting part was that he announced that he was signing a contract with the staff, including me, for another 4 years. Things looked absolutely wonderful. I said, Jeff, what are you talking about? And Jeff said, well, you're very lucky. It's a very strange situation. That night at 10:30, Jeff was still figuring out priorities, thinking about how to save, and we had disappeared. That afternoon, while we were meeting, Madoff was arrested. The largest fraud in the history of New York was shown. And this foundation, which was a foundation of approximately $230 million, was wiped out in 1 minute. Now, my friends, I want you to understand that we were major funders of 77 different organizations in Israel, all of whom were doing important work. The vast majority of them in the field of general education, in excellence in education, in helping to advance educational institutions, and some of them in the area of advancing Jewish identity among secular Israelis. In 1 day, the foundation was wiped out. And probably the hardest thing I ever did with my staff, one of whom is in the room tonight, was to have to go to these organizations and tell them it's over. And these were not people that we made a commitment, we're going to fund you this year. For many of them had built plans for years to come based on multi-year commitments we had done. I guess that event was for me not only a very painful one, but one that brought with it a lot of thinking about what's happening to the world that we're living in. You all have to understand that for me, having been the head of Meilitz for 30 years and president of Hill for 4 years, therefore having spent 34 years of my life raising money, all of a sudden I was handing out money, giving it away, By the way, it's the greatest to move from that one to the other, as I can imagine, until it collapses. It was an amazing feeling. But I think also that Jeff himself also moved from the world of raising money to the world of giving it away. I think we gave it away differently than others. We brought with it a sensitivity to the needs of the people who were turning to us. We enabled ourselves to get very deeply involved with the dreams of those who had turned to us, who were approaching us. We shared in their dreams. We helped them develop their dreams. We made multi-year commitments. It never entered my mind, Jeff, nor any single members of the board's mind, to ask the question of how are the funds of this foundation being invested. It simply didn't enter our minds. We were taking the personal wealth of an unbelievably generous individual who had asked us and a board of very distinguished Jewish leaders in America to help him spend his money correctly. We devoted all of our efforts to helping him figure out how to place the money in the right hands. We never asked the question. I'm not sure we should have. I don't know if we were right or we were wrong, but I can tell you that I've lost many sleepless nights over the issue because of the multiple year commitments we made to people without even knowing if we would have the funds for the future. It's a very, very painful thing to do. So since then, I've been trying to sit and take a pulse of what is it that I see happening in the field. And I'll expand a little bit. Most of you didn't give me much to say, so but I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I felt or that I feel are happening in the field. First of all, within foundations, I found two strangely different approaches going on right now in foundations and with philanthropists. One is a growing number of foundations and philanthropists who are talking about spending out the foundations. They're now living with serious commitments that they've made. They have less money than they ever had. They have a strong feeling they don't want to do what we were forced to do to those who are supporting. So let's take care of our commitments, but we will be getting rid of the capital. And this raises serious issues for the future. The second thing I see happening is the exact opposite. A growing number of philanthropists who are moving towards post-death giving. A difficulty to part today with funds creates a situation in which I'm making commitments for funds that will become available after I pass away. I find very few institutions, rather than the major ones in America, but in this country, who are preparing themselves to take advantage of that kind of funding for the future. Foundations are becoming more and more articulate on the specific areas that they want to fund. Jeff mentioned that in passing, the fact that in the past people look for foundations and try to help foundations fulfill the goals that the institutions want. Today, foundations are looking for the institutions that are going to fulfill the goals that they have. And much more than that, they are saying to themselves, I'm going to invest strategically so that my second investment is going to ensure that my first investment is going to pay off seriously. So they are limiting very much the areas of concern that they are willing to fund. I mean, I spent years, I know how to raise money. At least I knew how to raise money. It was great manner of charm, of speaking to people, of convincing them of... They bought the stories. It's so much more difficult today. They have a story. They want their story to be fulfilled. They have their dreams and their visions. And we are coming and trying to sell our visions and our dreams to people who are far more articulate about their own dreams and their own visions. course, there's a greater demand for accountability and due diligence that Jeff was talking about. The question, who else is doing what you are doing, is a question that I hear more often than I ever have heard in the past. And foundations and philanthropists know how to ask that question. I met with a philanthropist only 2 weeks ago who said to me, Avram, I've just had the 6th person come and tell me that they're doing exactly the same thing. From 6 different organizations. How do we get them to work together? How do we get them to talk to each other? I'll say more about that in a moment. Another thing is, foundations are talking more and more about how do we cooperate with other foundations in doing due diligence so that we can have better due diligence and spend less, each one of us independently, on due diligence. This is a trend that is growing and developing, and I think the Council of the Jewish Funders Network can be extremely helpful in helping that develop. Partnerships. If I have less to give away, who else can I find to join me in creating a partnership to do what I feel needs to be done? So philanthropists are talking much more to each other. Something new that I found, I've heard only in the last few days, more and more people saying, you know, we began people who were involved in the Chase Foundation. I look around me. I've given so much money to programs. I don't really know what happened with the money I gave to programs. The few buildings I gave are still there that I can show my grandchildren. And there may be a beginning of a reversion to something that we knew in the past and hasn't existed in the last 15 years, a reversion towards capital investment, building things on which you can place a plaque and create pride that you can share with your grandchildren in the future. These are factors that are developing on the side of the philanthropists and the foundations. Dangerous things that I see happening in institutions. Number one, more than anything else, a higher investment of human resources in trying to raise money rather than to do the things that these institutions were meant to do. It's amazing how much more time is now being spent by unbelievable educators, phenomenal social workers, great community builders, in trying to raise money rather than being able to do the things that they want to do. This is a hell of a price. A lot of our institutions are going to be doing less, not only because there is less money, but that the battle to raise the money is becoming that much harder that the people are not able to deal with those things that they were created to deal with. The redundancies and people out of work. 1,200 institutions, you said, may disappear. I guess that half of those institutions have at least half of their staff great people, highly talented, that the community has invested millions in training. What's happening with them today? Do you know the number of directors of bureaus of Jewish education, rabbis, great teachers, thinkers, social workers who are today unemployed and in order to find jobs, if lucky, are finding work outside the Jewish community because the Jewish community can't hire them? That is more than a financial loss. That's not only losing money we don't have now, that's losing money that we invested in manpower already then. What are we going to do about that? How do we prevent some of this waste from happening? Howard, did you plan this with my glasses? I think so. The mood and the spirit in organizations. Organizations I know and loved that we were funding. You meet with them today, there's dismal feeling. There's something in a fire that's dying. There's a passion that's getting lost. There's a total concern about staying around, about surviving. You sense it. You know where I begin to sense it? If I talk about a movement, and I'm not a Chabadnik, but I got to tell you something, that in Chabad around the world, I find organizations working with passion. One thing they had was passion. Unbelievable passion. I've visited places where I find that that passion is now lacking because they're totally concerned about whether they're going to be around tomorrow. And in some cases, the very desperation to survive can lead to impinging on the ethical behavior of some of the institutions. They're not becoming crooked, but no, I can't afford to pay the taxes now. And no, I can't afford to put away the benefits for the staff that I did. And I'll do it later. And these are having long-term effects, because if these places go under, the sum total cost is going to be phenomenal, and someone's going to have to pick it up. These are trends that I see. Now, I'm a grandfather, as you heard, of 14 grandchildren. If anybody wants to know how to do that, I can explain to you later. But the organization that I started is in reality the grandfather of maybe 40 institutions that exist within Israel. Not always the intentional grandfather. But back at the end of the 70s, I know of 2 organizations that were dealing in Jewish identity of secular Israelis. It was Melitz and Gesher. There are over 40 institutions in that field operating now. Most of them either worked for Melitz and Gesher or are the students of those who worked for Melitz and Gesher. And they've all been busy and they've all found time, and the differences between them, there's a concentration here on text, and there's a concentration over there on discussion groups, and there's a concentration over here on Jewish identity, and there's a concentration over here on Jewish peoplehood. And when we could afford it, the passion that people carried with themselves for their own institution was wonderful. The world can't afford it now. And in this one field, and by the way, it's the same thing in all fields. You find it in the people who are dealing with hunger, and you find it in the people who are dealing with general education. If they are going to continue to insist on working alone, they are all going to disappear. And if we don't find a way of creating, at a time of wonderful financial situation, that's a time when businesses, the best business you can be in, is mergers and acquisitions. At a time like today, the best business we should be in is creating mergers and acquisitions of non-profits, of how do we get them to combine efforts? How do we get them to share back office expenses? How do we get them to find ways of working together? It's not easy. I knew the Avram Infeld of 10 years ago. If he would hear me speaking now, he'd stand up in the audience and tell me to shut up. There's no way. You've got to understand. It's me. It's my people. We're doing something great, unique. It's different. You'll never understand how it. Let me try to explain to you. I can't explain it today, people, because the reality is saying to me, I'm either going to disappear together with all the others, or we're going to start to work together. It's desperate. Now, these are some of the trends which paint for me a very, very black picture. Are there any positive things I can say today? I have to, I'm Jewish. And I'll tell you why we Jews are always positive. The greatest thing about our Messiah is that he hasn't come. Can you imagine this world and say this is a world after the Messiah came? No way! But people, our Messiah hasn't come. That says there's hope. That says that things can be different. And I want to tell you about some things that I believe to really make the changes that we need to make now. Because, Jeff, if we would have hit this economic situation in 1994, we would have been in a much deeper hole than we were in the past. And that's because we didn't have the internet. And technology was not as advanced as it is today. And we would have been in a much worse situation. We have opportunities today. If we can get people to work together, we can find ways of funding our energies and our use of technology. I think we can come out of this situation perhaps even stronger than we went into it. We moved away to a situation in which 10% of the people, of the Jews, were giving 90% of the money. Does that always have to be? Is it possible that we can go back to a situation where 90% of the people give 70% of the money? Can we recreate a more flat Jewish world from that point of view? We could not without the web. We could not without the model of what Obama did. And we could not if we didn't have young Jews who we saw and thought were drifting away from the Jewish world, coming back into the Jewish world and bringing with them know-how in things that we, the old traditional Jewish professionals, knew nothing about. And they're there. And they're coming back. And they can help us. So I do believe that there's a way out of it. But there are also issues that we have to warn about. My last 4 statements. Number 1, is an ethical one. We've been through a period of such affluence. We brought into the world of Jewish giving, through private foundations and means, people who expected to see their Jewish professionals earn as much as the professionals in their businesses did. I don't know if we didn't create excess. When I hear of high school principals earning $400,000 a year, it raises a question for me. I don't want them to go back to $40,000 a year. And the world we're in can no longer afford those accesses. Even if we improve the situation, we're going to have to remedy some of those. Creating larger boards of different kinds of people who ask different kinds of questions, who are challenging, becomes a primary concern and something we have to ensure that our institutions and our foundations and our organizations adopt very, very quickly. We can see organizations that prevented Madoff from impacting on those organizations, and we can see how those large organizations which lost money to Madoff, I'm not talking about the foundation, I'm talking about the institutions, who in some cases, instead of spending money, invested money. And I don't know if that's what they should have done. But if they did, they invested very often because they accepted situations of conflict of interest and turned their back on them. I think we have a problem with that. But as we enter into this world of trying to remedy what we're doing, we're going to ask ourselves 3 questions. Number 1, how are we going to invest? You will hear today in the discussion about the crisis, people justifying the trend of moving away from the centralized giving, and you will find a whole world of people who are talking about now is the time to go back to centralized giving. I don't know the answer, but we're back at the beginnings of that discussion again. And I think it has to be a serious discussion within the Jewish people. Can it be that there is not there are not central bodies of the Jewish people that sit together and determine what their priorities are? Is every person of means going to continue to determine what our priorities should be? It's a serious question. Secondly, where are we going to spend our funds? How do we encourage Jews to give a larger proportion of their funds to Jewish causes than to non-Jewish causes? Jeff began to describe the young person who's now involved in the Jewish community. He's very different from things I knew in the past. Spent those years as president of Hillel. Do you know that my last year of campus, we did a survey. My last year on the job, we did a survey on campuses. 47% of Jewish students on campuses in North America have less than 2 Jewish parents. I don't want to say they all have one, some of them may have none. But you're living with a different person who comes from a different background, and I'm talking about people who were involved in Hillel, who define themselves as Jews. 47% had only one Jewish parent. An interesting thing that we heard from students over and over again. I desperately want my children to be Jewish, and who I marry has nothing to do with that. People get used to hearing that. We are going to hear more and more of that. The worst thing I could do in a room packed with students was get up and talk about the dangers of intermarriage. I could do that on a one-to-one basis with students, but if I tried to do it in the hall, they would have thrown me out of the window. It's not even, what are you telling them? That what their parents did was wrong. That's the world we're in. People have to find a way of overcoming that. These are the new Jews who are coming to make it. And lastly,
but it's a Torah law. If they identify the law, that's not a Torah.
It's a very serious question.
The students, they have to learn.
Is where are we going to invest the resources we have? It's the old discussion of outreach. Are we going to spend our money in reaching out to those we want to desperately keep within the field, although they're pulling away? Or are we going to invest more and more in strengthening the central core and making it stronger? I don't know where I stand in the debate. I know where I do stand in the debate. I want enough money to do both. We don't have it. Thank you very much for listening.
We've had a tremendous amount of food for thought. And that opens up the floor for question and answer, discussion. The question was, who in this Jewish world, I think she pointed particularly to Avram in terms of what he was saying, bringing organizations together, looking at efficiencies, mergers, acquisitions, etc., who's going to lead us toward doing that?
I don't know if I'm going to answer any of the questions. My late father said to me, if you've got something to say, say it. If it doesn't answer the questions, it's a sign that they asked the wrong questions. So I'm going to try to at least relate to some of them in some way. sad to hear about the correction of 51. I did say my last year was 47. If it's gone that fast, it's terrible, but what's happening? I don't know if any institution here is going to change their way of functioning. I don't know if we're going to start moving towards the kinds of mergers and joint work without being prodded and pushed by the philanthropists. If the sources of our funding do not demand that kind of behavior from us, it's not going to happen on our own. And I really believe that somehow we who are really concerned about this happening have got to find a way of getting philanthropists to talk together and for them to find ways of demanding and insisting on this thing happening. But I want to make a much wider thing because a lot of you raised the question of what are we really going to be spending our money on? And this is not the time to hire strategic consultants to help us get out of the situation. I have to tell you a story. I don't know if you know the story that there was this shepherd tending his flock. He had a very big flock of sheep. And all of a sudden a car rolls up, a Ferrari, and a guy gets out of the car. He's wearing a beautifully tailored suit, beautifully tailored shoes. He goes up to the shepherd. He says, "Mr. Shepherd, if I can tell you how many sheep you have, can I have one?" And the shepherd says, "That sounds like an interesting idea. Why don't you try?" So the guy pulls out a computer. He looks at the sheep. He does a couple of things. He comes out and says, "You've got 12,904 sheep." The guy says, "Exactly. Go ahead." The guy picks up the animal, puts it in the car, is about to drive off. And the shepherd says, "Listen, if I can guess your profession, can I have it back?" He says, "Yeah, that's interesting. Try that." He says, "I bet that you're a consultant." He said, "How did you know?" He says, "First of all, you came here without my asking you. Secondly, you gave me information that I already had. Thirdly, you showed me that you know nothing about my business. That's my dog that you put in the car." This is not the time for consultants. Because if we really want to be able to have a serious discussion on what the priorities are and where we should be putting our money, we have to begin to dream again about what the Jewish people should be and should look like. Without a vision, ve'en chazon yipara am. Without a vision, the end of the people. And somebody raised the question of the issue of peoplehood. And where are we going? We are living in a world where we are desperately lacking a central Jewish vision of what's important and of how we should look. We do not encourage dreamers. We should be doing that because when you have a dream, you can ask yourself a question: in order to attain that dream, what are the priorities? But without that dream, how are we going to do it? I don't know the answer to that.
Trying to combine some of the questions and points, and even disagree with my friend Abraham on one issue. It's 1949. A UJA fundraiser gets the opportunity to come to Israel. He comes back to the States, goes to his donors and says, "I can't believe it. All the lies I told you last year are true." The issue of vision and dreams is absolutely critical. When it comes to the question of what are the lessons learned specifically from the Madoff experience, whether you're a foundation or a nonprofit, and I say this from painful experience at our foundation. At our foundation, I made the same error that you did. I came, the Bronfman family had investment managers and everything else. I did not take personal oversight of the investments. 60% of the foundation assets were in Seagram stock. Seagram was merged with Vivendi, stock lost 80% of its value. Today, only once should those mistakes happen. And the question that's being asked today, regardless of size of boards, are what things are being put into place to protect assets. We have outside investment advisors who are volunteers who sit as an investment committee, developing policies around investments. No more than 10% of our assets can be in any one investment. And it starts with diversification. You don't have to be such a chacham to know somebody goes down, it's 10%, no more than 10%. And one of the sad realities of that is sometimes the investors who are doing best, we take their money away from them because they go past the 10%. But having a series of procedures that are in place, including the most stringent conflict of interest procedures, is absolutely critical. This is community's money. It's not the money of the individual donor any longer. It's the community's money, and the issue of stewardship is absolutely critical. While it's often difficult to see miracles in our time, it's often difficult to know when the good old days were the good old days. And back in the good old days, I was involved in creating lots of mergers and acquisitions among nonprofits as a funder, at UJ Federation. We helped 20 agencies go out of business because they were no longer fulfilling their mission, or we merged, or they were acquired. With 20/20 hindsight, I recently published an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy arguing against what I called mindless merger mania. Everybody who starts a nonprofit starts with a very exciting vision, and they are trying to do it better. 50 to 80% of businesses that merge fail as a result of the merger. 50 to 80% of businesses that merge fail as a result of the merger. The reason is culture always trumps strategy. And it's very hard, with all of the money that businesses have to sweeten the merger, to create a common culture. In nonprofits, it's almost impossible. So where I fully agree with Abraham is the idea of combining back offices. Somebody who wants to go into the Jewish education business doesn't do it because she or he wants to manage insurance. They're not in the insurance management business. They're usually lousy at it. And the more we can combine back offices, the more we will have the great educators being focused on education. And that's something that funders can do.
I agree with your disagreement with me.
The final point is around creating more partners and modeling change differently. And I would use Taglit Birthright as an example of something started by two Meshuggahs who paid for the first 8,000 young people to come. Today, 220,000 later, there are many partners, some of whom are major donors, and some of whom give $50. We recently got a check for $50 from an unemployed father of two daughters from Iowa who went on Birthright. And he said, I wish I could give more. I'm unemployed. I'm on unemployment insurance. But he sent him $50. And one of the great hires, it was actually a consultancy that we did, was we took somebody out of the Obama organization to build the e-giving of Birthright. Because it's a different game. It's about being interactive. It's about, what the genius of what the Obama campaign did is that they asked your opinion. I still get emails asking me, what do I think about the healthcare program, and do I think this or do I think that? And there's always a donate now there. Well, the more I get engaged, the more I'm likely to press the donate now because I'm part of that engagement. And just as we have learned to engage major donors, as Abraham points out, the internet gives us the opportunity at very little cost to engage younger people and to engage smaller donors. And it's absolutely critical to what we do. Now the real final point. And that is, just after the Madoff scandal, the Jewish Funders Network created an interest-free loan fund for organizations that were affected by Madoff. And they basically, a number of funders essentially paid the interest, or what would have been the interest, on loans being made to those organizations to buy them time to recover. And at the same time, provided the assistance to them to combine their back offices and lower their administrative overhead. That was leadership by the Jewish Funders Network. We need 1,000 times that kind of leadership at this moment in time, because that's the kind of thing that is so important as we go forward.
Thanks, Joe.
Many of the questions, I would argue, come together on the question of are we going to be insular, or are we going to be more universal in our thinking? Today there are 162 diasporas in the world. 162 diasporas. We may have been the first, but it's not anymore ours. And so our young people who live in a flat world look at a diaspora not in Jewish terms, but they look at it as part of life. Today there's a birthright Poland, there's a birthright Jamaica, there's a birthright Ireland, based on birthright Israel, to bring people back to their home communities, to take the lessons from the Jews. You know, it's not accidental that the Dalai Lama sent several of his advisors to Jewish camps 20 years ago to learn how do we keep the love alive for people who are no longer in their country, their home country. So we need to, and this speaks to a number of the questions that are raised. If we are going to be insular, we are more likely to lose the next generation. They are not insular. And that speaks to Rabbi David's questions about how does the Jewish agency and the WZO reinvent themselves. If they continue the path that they've been taking, which is to act like a government that has a tax exemption, that's not a compelling visionary story. That's not going to continue to draw support. If we come to the question of how to influence change in organizations, these organizations, for the most part, are democratic. And getting involved, first as volunteers, then on the boards, then as an officer, is the way change happens. It's not easy. It is hard work. But that's a critical involvement. And in terms of 3 tips to raise money for Amutot, I would start with board development, and then second would be board development, and third would be board development. Boards, you know, it's like real estate, location, location, location. Boards bear this responsibility and need to understand that it's not a development staff that has all of the responsibility of raising money. It has to be owned and felt by every trustee, and every trustee needs to take that ownership of development, which would make for a far greater strength within the organization.
I want to relate to 2 points. I want to board development, board development, board development. You cannot develop a board if you do not have a clearly articulable vision to what the Amuta is doing and why it's doing. Most Amutot that I know of sense a mission They do not have a way of articulating that mission in a way which can be heard and to be used in building a board. Without an articulatable mission, nothing begins. So that's the first thing that I would try to do. The second is board, the third is board, and then the fourth is board. I want to answer the question about the Tfutsa, about the diaspora. I know of very few, I know of no Jews in America who believe that they're in Galut. Period. Chabadnikim were in Galut waiting for the Mashiach, but the Mashiach already came. Others are not waiting for Mashiach, do not feel a sense of Galut, and I don't blame them, they are not. I know that Jews always thought that we're living in the diaspora is suffering. I was in Beverly Hills, California just 2 weeks ago. I saw the suffering of my people. It was unbelievable. You don't know whether to swim your indoor pool or your outdoor pool. The concept of Galut, I want to tell you more than that. That the word diaspora is very different from the diaspora, other diasporas that exist in the world. All other diasporas began at some place and left, and not 3,000 years ago, but recently. The Irish diaspora, people who left Ireland over the last 100 years. The Jewish diaspora is a diaspora that hasn't come on Aliyah. In other words, they are not in the state. They do not have a sense even of diaspora, in my opinion. I think that they do have a sense of belonging to some degree to a thing called the Jewish people. And I want to talk for just one moment about birthright. As you know, I was involved with you at the very beginnings of birthright. I never expected the success to be the success that it is. But a sentence that I keep repeating is that if you really want to pinpoint the success of birthright, never mind whether they come in a great program like Hillel or they come in a lousy program by anybody else. Whatever the program they come on, it's a phenomenal experience. They get the wow. But you know what they're saying wow about? What I was told is being Jewish and rejected is not necessarily so. My experience in Israel doesn't only tell me something about Israel, it tells me something about my being Jewish. What is that about my being Jewish? That I am not a religion, that's what I was told back home. That I am not somebody who is dropped off by the parents at a synagogue and said, I reject that picture that I have of being Jewish. You know what happened to me in Israel? I saw people speaking a language I refused to learn. That they didn't even try to teach me properly. Something changes in their understanding of what it means to be a Jew. That's the greatest success of birthright. We have to go ahead and develop a concept where we teach Jewish peoplehood. I'm a shomer mitzvot. Judaism is not my religion. Judaism is the religious culture of my people. And I'm a member of that people. Neither in Israel or in the diaspora do we teach that. And if we teach that properly, we can make a major difference. I thank you all for being here this evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, just one comment I must. On the notion of board, it's about being a board. It's all about leadership and leadership networking. I want to thank you, Jeffrey. I want to thank you, Abraham, for your time, your thoughts, your preparation, your sharing with us tonight. I also want to thank all of you that have come.